That's the idea. I think we hinted at this a little bit in the beginning, but this idea that, as a society, we're progressing past Christian values, what people that say, these religious fundamentalists believe these things that like homosexuality or transgenderism, these things are wrong, but now we're past that as a society. We're better than that.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of pressure on Christians today. So
Yeah.
how do we deal with this? Obviously, we have some beliefs that are very countercultural. So how do we look at this from a biblical perspective?
Well, I think it's first of all understanding, it's not always that old is bad and new is good, because when people say I'm progressive, or when people say well, because I believe that that in LGBT rights, they'll say I'm progressive, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
I I kind of I want to remind people what progressive really means. Progressive means moving forward, not going backwards, right? Because if you're going backwards, then that's kind of considered traditional. And progressive means you're evolving, and you're moving forward. But when we look at the history of mankind and we go back, let's just stick to the Western world, and we go back 2,000 years to the time of the Greco-Roman world in Europe, we find that homosexual relationships were actually the norm. Now, were they, what people call pedophile relationships? Well, how do you define pedophile? Because these weren't older men having, sex with babies or even children or infants. They were actually just adult men that would have these sexual relationships with prepubescent young, maybe teenagers. And we would say, well, that's pedophilia anyway. Well, remember that actually the marrying age for men and women, the women would be around that age anyway, around teenagers. And I'm not justifying it. I'm just laying the history of what it is. But homosexuality was quite the norm. Now, there's this myth that it was only that form of a male and maybe a teenage boy. That's not true. There's significant evidence and people writing about how these relationships would not always, but sometimes progress into when they are both adults. So it wasn't unknown. So homosexuality was normal and it was not uncommon at all. And when we go back to, even maybe a few more hundred years before that, to ancient Israel, all the nations around ancient Israel, homosexual relationships and activity and behavior was quite common. So when people say they're being progressive, that's actually not really accurate. They're being regressive. And so I think it's helping people to know that just because we're holding to something from the past doesn't necessarily mean it is bad. And what is ultimately the question is, what is truth? And what are we going to hold to as something that we believe is good? Is truth good? Is absolute truth good? Or is truth something that we just it just evolves? Because then the person who is progressive, I would say, well, if what we believed 10 years ago or 50 years ago is bad, and now what you believe is good, it's actually very possible, if not very, very likely, that what you believe now is going to be bad in 50 years. And so it's not trying to be what is relevant for the time. It's actually trying to find what is true and what is real. And is there anything that is absolute?